morning, everyone. My name is Saurabh Bhandari. I work for Mott MacDonald. We're going to talk about disaster recovery projects and what role controls as a profession has in it, and how can controls, and especially program controls, be used to help recovery and rebuild projects perform better. I've worked for Mott MacDonald for quite a few years. I'm an architect by trade, or used to be an architect for a good amount in the industry, then migrated into management consultancy and into project management and controls. I'm quite passionate about controls because the best projects that I've ever worked on have had really good and really professional project controls people. And I like reading a lot, and therefore you would see in my presentations I've got quite a few models and theories that we've picked up and built up and crystallized, which hopefully will help you if you ever were involved in a disaster recovery project. I'll give you some facts about disasters in a bit, but this is an increasing trend that we see across many countries, that more and more natural disasters are happening as we run through and the climate change impacts are starting to happen. And disaster recovery and rebuild projects don't actually have much documentation, much guidance available at this moment of time in the PM professional industry. There's quite a lot with the national governments in terms of immediate emergency responses, but not very much in terms of rebuild. The case study I'm going to talk about, which I was involved in over the last year, acting as the program director for this works, is the Cumbria Infrastructure Recovery Program, which is primarily a highways recovery program after Storm Desmond events back in December 2015, during the Christmas season. And what I'm going to present to you are a series of insights of things that we did as a team, things that worked, and things that I think are probably something that can be repeated by anyone performing any of these kind of roles which require urgent action. And these are insights built on some fast-track recovery projects I've done, but also, for those of you who know me, and I can see some friendly faces here, I'm a bit urgent by nature. So if you are involved in any kind of urgent projects, I think these formulas actually apply to your projects as well. The insights that I'm going to provide to you are, of course, just thoughts which I've gathered, but also I've worked with some really good professionals while doing this project, and some really good clients, actually. And these are thoughts that I've actually gleaned from them, so it's just not me who believes that these are the ways of actually doing this stuff. The agenda now that we have is, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the relevance of disaster and post-disaster recovery, because there is a lot of stuff that is happening, and believe it or not, it does impact all of us. We're going to talk about what is it that we did, how did we do it, and I'm going to break it down into scheduling, into cost, into reporting at a later stage. But first of all, we'll develop how should you really approach these problems, rather than jumping straight in and assuming it's a typical project, which these aren't. And at the end, more than happy to answer questions. I'm just conscious that this is a 30-minute, 35-minute presentation. I'm going to talk to you about what we did over a period of a year. So if I do skip over a few things, feel free to scribble away, make notes. Happy to answer questions at the end, during the lunch hour, or do come over to our stand and I'll talk to you happily about it. Or drop me a line and I'll answer your queries. Just to give you a bit of an idea, this is a chart distributed by UNCR as well as the WEF. And that's the number of disasters that are happening all over the world. If you look at the slide on the right-hand side, those are the number of natural disasters that are currently recorded back in 2015, 2016, all over the world. 1,500 natural disasters. Flooding is a major disaster event that has impacted more communities. To give you an idea, disasters at this moment of time are displacing populations twice the size of all of the United Kingdom every single year. Every 10 years, we lose more money in disasters than the whole of the UK GDP, or even GDPs of the countries that are coming along the way. And most of that money is lost because of the lack of the rebuild efforts that we undertake. And these are all studies that both the UN have done, World Economic Forum has done, and there is a very good and a big role for the project managers and the project management community that it can do to deliver these projects better, faster, quicker. Now, what happens in a disaster situation, and that's most important to understand if you were to get context around this. When a disaster event strikes, whether that's flood or whether that's earthquake, a few things happen consequently. You suffer a lot of infrastructure damage. That might be road, highways, nuclear plants that we've known about. It leads to communities that are severed from the main arteries of whether there's power arteries coming through or road arteries coming through, or just general community facilities. That leads to a lot of sociological impacts, economic impacts, and if these aren't actually stopped very quickly and very urgently, not just the recovery effort after the disaster event, the emergency response, but after that, you end up with a crisis. And we've seen that happening in the US when the Storm Katrina happened, and a few years later, they were still not recovering from it. And that's the same thing that's happening still in the south part of America, where certain communities have been left to their devices. So here's a small theory and a model. And that is, if you do not actually stop this chain of events, you will end up with a mega crisis. And what that would mean is, if you're then trying to deliver a project in that environment, it adds another layer of political and economic complexity that stops you doing your work because people are too busy fighting for the same amount of funds because they do not trust the government and the project managers who are actually trying to deliver this job. And the only way to actually beat that is to actually be forward-thinking, to take action and just not waste a lot of time procrastinating and thinking, how do I get into a stable state for a baseline? So let's get into Cumbria. Most of you probably know it as the Lake District. Lots of lakes, lots of rain. In the northwest, like where I live, we're used to rain. We have a lot of highway assets in Cumbria. It's the third largest county of England, very sparsely populated, 500,000 people, but generally in the rural community. So highway assets are really important for them. And what happens is, when these communities actually have these disasters, they get progressively impacted. In November 2015, I remember it was fairly wet, and then Storm Desmond came. Cumbria recorded the highest rainfall that it ever had. And you can see the statistics on the screen there. But after that, Storm Desmond wasn't the only killer. Storm Eva came in probably a couple of days later, and then Storm Frank. And before we knew, there was an enormous amount of infrastructure damage that happened all over the county. 10% of the population couldn't actually, a working population couldn't actually get to work. And Cumbria as an economy is primarily a service economy. So if you go back to the events that happen after disaster, if you don't build these links back, what happens first is economic disaster strikes, and suddenly people start losing a job. Politicians start getting a bit nervous about it. And then everyone starts doing reactive repairs and reactive measures, which don't really actually solve any major problems. So Mott MacDonald were invited pretty much as soon as this event happened, because the council leadership realized and recognized, to be fair to them, as a very leadership-driven client, that they needed help. Not because they couldn't do it, but because there was too much to do. We got in there and we were told there might be a few dozen major impacts on assets. And that's what everyone believed at that time, because information was so sparse and it was still coming in from disconnected systems. People were still reporting within their own siloed areas to say, that's what the problem is in my parish. We didn't actually have a complete picture, and that's what we walked into. And before we knew, all of these started coming across to us. And this was disaster on a massive scale. Communities were flooded. And luckily, we did lose one person from the community during these floods. But primarily, a lot of people were losing jobs. And this was early January now. And June is the tourism season. If you don't actually repair very, very quickly, a year of very little tourism in Cumbria can pretty much kill the whole county. And especially in these times, that is something that we could not afford. So we knew that 2 bridges were washed away, but there was a massive amount of infrastructure damage. How do you actually start planning and delivering these kind of jobs and project managing these jobs? And that is what I think the conversation today is about. We collected all of the information, and this is the picture that we discovered. We knew there were over 1,600 assets that were impacted. 2,500 kilometers of road network was in one or the other state. They were continually degrading. 300 bridges were impacted, whereas the community was now open because we thought most of the bridges were safe. We were slowly discovering on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis that the bridges that we thought were safe weren't actually safe because water was still actually going through the abutments, and you had a developing problem. One thing which was quite clear to us, this wasn't going to be just about building infrastructure. It was going to be more than that, simply because, and that's why I call it a program rather than a project, we were really delivering outcomes here. We were really thinking about, the mission was to connect the communities. It didn't matter whether every single bridge was fixed or whether that bridge that was really important in the network was fixed. If it didn't actually help the local communities, maybe it had a lower priority. So the mission statement, as we saw it, was twofold. One was it was actually connecting communities, and the second one was tourism was fragile, and we had to make sure that whatever we did actually acted up to it. Now, of course, in a typical program project environment, you still have to think about all of the other aspects, which is your efficiency, your value, because your governance still wants you to spend the money the best way they think they can. But what we also realized that this was not just about safe delivery and delivering just on time, cost, and quality. We could do with the amount of money, so give you an estimate, because I haven't actually talked about cost for specific reason, because people get fixated on it. When we did the initial estimate on this, we were thinking our damages was 250 million pounds. There was no chance we were going to get that money. That's like the entire budget for a few years. We looked at it from a point of view to say, whatever money we get, and we're still talking to DFT and the Treasury about what monies we should really be getting, was we had to do something more. Whatever money we actually had to spend, and that was part of the program culture that I said, was we would use our suppliers as much as we can. 2 reasons. I didn't have the time to actually go away and procure a tier 1 contractor, because that will take 3 to 6 months, and then we'll probably have a fight amongst us. If I use a local community, the pound was actually going back into the Cumbrian community, and basically, if you use local contractors, they actually understand why it is important, because most of their families work there. And Cumbria is also a great place because you've got Sellafield there, and you've got so many other manufacturers. There's a huge community of engineers and controls professionals and builders in Barrow. If we could actually raise the game, use this money to raise the game and get the productivity, which in the morning at the keynote we were talking about, we could actually add so much more. So we made that the mission. So there's a slight challenge. In a disaster recovery project, none of these people go away. The funders still want efficiency and effectiveness. The governance still wants affordability, and are you spending my money democratically? You've got all of these challenges still happening with you. And of course, the community, if you don't act fast, they become distrustful. It's a very complex picture to handle from a controls point of view, because I do believe controls are there to enable the projects. And if we were to actually do it the traditional way of actually making sure we ticked every box in everyone's index and met their standards of typical project delivery, we'd still be here 6 to 9 months later and having not delivered anything, and the communities would be in crises. So we actually developed 2 models, which I can theorize now, and of course these weren't written down models at those times. These are the activities that we did, which I can explain as a model. If the intent was to make delivery happen, these 2 models were If you look at the amount of control, and control, if you treat control as something that might add friction to the delivery, might actually slow things down, that depends on the complexity of the project and your risk appetite. So project might be really complex and therefore might give you unforeseen answers that you're not ready for. But if you've got a high risk appetite, you can possibly live with a lower level of control. Now, asking that for a government to do is probably impossible, and asking for the community to do is probably impossible. But what we did was we introduced something that I call the Emergent Baseline as a concept. And what that actually means is it's a baseline with all of the natural elements of scope, time, cost. But everyone understands that they're buying into it because it's a journey of a baseline. It has enormous amount of uncertainty. It has possibly very little chances of staying where it is, but because we've got a mandated process, a refinement process that everyone believes and still allows you to refine it in an auditable manner, you will come on a journey. So I'll give you an example. If I was to actually engage a builder with a work package of saying, I'll give you 50 bridges to actually rebuild and repair, I've got an idea what the scope is today, and these are real stories. If I ask you for a fixed price, you're probably not going to want to come and play. If I was to come in to you and say, I'll give you an option E agreement, we know what the scope is today, but I know these bridges are degrading every day, and you still have to go through the EA process and stuff. But what we will do is we will actually decide what the price needs to be further down the chain. The same for the governance to say, I've now hired a contractor for £500,000. We know we've got 20 assets in it. It might be that we can only afford to do 15 assets in that amount of money because your governance doesn't allow you to add more money to it, but we'll do the 15 best assets. Now, this is quite difficult for most people to actually capture. But if you've got, and if you play on the spirit, and that's the positive spirit of a post-disaster recovery phase, is people are willing and able and flexible. They will do anything to help as long as they can see action, as long as they can see fairness, and they can see their scrutiny and their level to be maintained. I think that is something that project controls need to be played on. I think the point I'm trying to make is, do not get stuck, as project controllers sometimes do and project managers sometimes do, to go and challenge the fact that you might want a P80, P90, P50 estimate or a schedule or whatever else in a typical project. That is not something that's going to happen in disaster relief. But what we would do is by the time we hit site, we would have a lot less uncertainty. And I think those two concepts, you'd see how we've translated them all the way through. So I can define this. So what we used is a programmatic control approach, which was based on outcomes. Nobody was saying this bridge will cost £50,000 to repair. We said that work package is going to connect this community. It's going to cost £500,000. We've got redundancy within the work packages. If we needed to take certain things out, we'll take them out. If we found that there was too much damage and we'd not catered for it, we would take some of those assets and build them later, or repair them later, or find new funding for it, but we will get the stuff done which needed to be done. Going back to connecting the communities. Baselines were used more as guides. So one of the things to do when you're doing emergent baselines, and if some of you are interested, more than happy to talk to you later on about it, is to build enough safeguards to what you're calling a baseline. So when I say we can take work packages out or bridges out of the work package, this is to give our guys who are making these decisions to say your decisions are not irreversible, so you can actually make a decision with me today and come back on the journey, and if you decide this is not what you want to do, we can take a few things out. And that is what project controls should be doing, is to giving people ideas as to how they could resolve the situation. If they only had 3 months to do the stuff, they could move on with it. And this is just for your ideas to actually say, when you're looking at program controls versus project controls, there's a significant difference between it. In program controls, what we worked towards was less on compliance, but to leverage governance, to say where the decision needs to be made, when does it need to be made, and if the decision can be delayed and we can progress with the works that we're doing, we should continue. And of course, working with good people helps. So I'll get straight into the meat of it. What does this really mean? This is all good in terms of theory. Let's start with how did we organize ourselves? So being a controls person, I generally think in controls account. So even the org structure that I put together was based on that theory. So when we started off the job back in January, we had no idea how many work packages we had, how many things that we had to do. But we did know that if we didn't get ourselves organized very, very quickly, when the work actually started, it'll be too late. So let me just make this a bit clearer. So Cumbria as a council is divided into 3 districts, east, west, and south. And that's how their operational units are actually built, the highways maintenance divisions and stuff. What we did was, we didn't try and disrupt anything. We said that's what we got to work with. So we divided our organization into a matrix. The project delivery teams, so project managers, were basically aligned vertically with where the things was. And I'll talk about the bubbles in a second. And then we said we had to design a program because we didn't know which projects we had to do and what their priority was and which ones to do and which ones to leave and what impact on the community and the whole complexity around it. So we said we'll have somebody actually just looking at it across the board because you still had to deal with the politics, and our project managers aren't pretty good at dealing with that stuff because that had to be coordinated centrally. We put a commercial and procurement function because suddenly we were asking a supply chain that's generally used to have long procurement cycles, long time of preparations, to say, Mr. Builder, I'm going to give you a contract through competition. You have 2 weeks to respond. I'm going to give you 50 assets. The working window finishes in 2 months' time. I've got to get you all of the licenses. Your average project is 5 days long, and I'm going to give you 60 of them. And we did this with 12 different Tier 2 builders. The only way we could do that was if we could actually run that procurement in a way, because as with bids, especially if they're bids of the same kind, if you're a good builder and who knows how to bid stuff, you might end up winning all of them, but you haven't got the capacity to do all of them. So this had to be done centrally. So that was something that the controls guys actually looked at. The moment they looked at comparing the schedules and said, you haven't got the resources to do it, who would you take in partnership, or we're going to give it to someone else? Now, this was something that allowed us to get the works carried on pretty quickly. Program controls in terms of scheduling, cost management, reporting, risk, change, we did that centrally. The reason why we did it centrally, when I say centrally, of course, most of the change control and action was happening by the project managers in the various areas, working with the teams that were already there. We had to form a full picture. So if you go back to my emergent baseline of saying, well, you would flex within an area that I'll give you, this had to be coordinated centrally so that as a program director, if somebody said, that project that we thought was a couple of £100,000 is now 3 million, how are we going to fund it? Where are we going to get the money? I had to see the full picture. And there were a couple of examples. Broomhall Bridge, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. We initially thought that was £2.5 million. When we worked with our engineers, with our local guys, we got it down to a £650,000 project to get it to fix the network. Not the same what it was before, but rather than demolishing and building a new bridge, we said we could make it a cycle bridge because network didn't actually require it, but we could do it with less money. So those kind of innovations were done. It'll be, especially with the risk guys out here, it'll be a bit sad if I don't talk about risk. We didn't have the luxury, for whatever reason, to actually have a full-time risk manager. It's quite difficult to find good risk managers that are not working for other organizations in that area. But every project manager, and because of the nature of work we were doing, ended up being a risk person. But what we did do was we made sure that particular project managers or control account managers actually own a particular risk source in order to, because this was not about just releasing risk budgets, this was actually about managing the risk. Bridges, as my favorite example in here, we were working with the Environment Agency, and they did a fantastic job in collaborating with us. Typically, Cumbria County Council generally sends around 6 assets for them to actually give their consents and SSIs on. We went to them after we'd done an integrated schedule, say, EA, we're going to come to you for 300 consents, which you have to give us to in 3 weeks because your river working window finishes in 6 weeks. How about that? And the first thing is, well, we haven't got resources to do that. We worked through our risk managers to actually work with them to understand how we could actually accelerate it through the pipeline, and used quite a lot of what the IPA was saying this morning, the manufacturing pipeline techniques of actually saying, how much of this work could we get finished before it even reached the EA? So our first conversation with EA was, what will stop you approving an application that was made straight away? He said, most of it is because applications have a lot of errors and they don't even consider what was there. So we hired someone just to do that at the front end even before it went to the EA. So it was more about risk management by the controls team, but we could see that picture. The controls team could show us that picture pretty much in week 2 to say, if you're serious about doing this, that is your biggest block, that's your biggest constraint. And theory of constraint is something that we've used all the way through. But the control account manager's role was just not actually managing the budget, it was actually managing the delivery of the job. They had full accountability of getting this done, but also the tool and the leverage. So if somebody had to speak to the minister to get it sorted, it was done, it was escalated. Right, your favorite topic, planning, scheduling. So we didn't do much scheduling. We did a lot of planning. But we did use a lot of the scheduling concepts for it. So that's Broomall Bridge, Broomall Castle. It was completely destroyed, severing any access to that. And it's grade 2 listed as well, so everyone was involved. We knew why we were doing it. We did have a small problem. If somebody was to ask me, where are your assets? Half my assets were still under the water line. I did not even know if they were still there or what condition they were in. We didn't know who's actually going to do it, whether we were going to be able to do it, what level of damage it is, whether we had the budget to do it, what the estimate. It was a nightmare in terms of, if I was to ask you to schedule such a job, you had no basis of producing a schedule. So we came up with a plan. And I'd say that's what you need to actually do. If you haven't got anywhere to start, put some targets on and starting towards them. Simply because we actually got also buy-in from our leadership, from the council, right up to the politicians to say, that's what we're targeting. We might not succeed, but we haven't got any other plan if we don't do this. So we targeted these plans, we moved forward, we delivered the acute projects, and we started working towards making these things happen. But with lack of information, this traditional planning and scheduling was too laborious for us. So what we did was, we used our GIS system. And GIS systems are generally used by designers and sometimes planners to work out where exactly the things are and things that will inform the schedule. What we did was, we actually did a bit of creative use of it. We got every single asset that the county hold across the board. You use their current asset management systems to collect the information, but we then allowed our teams, as well as our practitioners, out in the field, the operational teams, to edit that data to tell us what was wrong with it. How much time did they think in their experience? And these are highway maintenance people who do this day in, day out. How long did they think it'll take? What kind of price do they think, if they were using the supply chain, they would take? What kind of impact did it have on the network? Because within the GIS system, we could also ask them to model with our teams to say, what if we were doing work on this bridge and had to shut it down or put temporary road closures? Would the impact be on the rest of the network? Would we get a lot of outcry? The things that were fundamental to planning, which will take generally ages to plan, we went from 1,600 assets to 40-odd work packages in 6 weeks. Which was fantastic, because we could then tell the supply chain, these were the assets you're doing, that's the sequence you're going to do it in, that's the reason why you're going to do it. But most importantly, for our stakeholders, for our governance, for our communities, we could tell them we had a plan. And that meant that when we went to a landowner to say, we're going to set up site on your block, because we've got to get this bridge done, we had a lot more buy-in. And that's quite important. Sometimes we get stuck by the tools that we have, and for these projects, you have to think outside the box. If you haven't got information, you have to start backwards as to how would you do it if you weren't in your MSP, Primavera, Asta, whichever world you're in. So what does it mean to plan in GIS? So this is a bit more detail. I don't know whether it's legible. Is it legible at all to you, this stuff? Sorry. This table at the end? To give you an idea, I mean, it's that block in the center that you see. I don't know whether this is working, probably not. That was the basis of all of the information. We had around 33 attributes we asked people to populate. But if you divide it by people, the number of people that were being done, it told us which parish council it was in, whether it was a main river or a low or a non-SSI site. It told us everything that we needed to know. And then what we used was what you call fragnets in your P6 world. We created fragnets by the types and classifications of projects that we're doing. We classified projects as type 1, type 2, type 3. We developed some fragnets for them. We assembled those fragnets as soon as we knew what kind of projects or what kind of asset this project would be. And lo and behold, we had an integrated schedule. Now, that wasn't a delivery schedule, but it gave you a pretty good idea which projects needed to be done first, which projects would have a long lead in because of the amount of consenting that it had to undertake. Because remember, Cumbria, more than a third of Cumbria is the Lake District National Park. And you cannot touch anything there without all of your consents. That gave us a pretty good idea of what the schedule needed to be. And we had a pretty integrated schedule very, very quickly. But what that brought out was what our blockages were, where our consenting issues were, where our buildability issues were. But there's another problem with flood recovery projects. And that is about fairness. You can do all of this technical stuff and say, my computer tells me after this analysis, these are the projects that need to be done first. Wrong answer. You can't deal with that with flood recovery projects simply because flood recovery projects or any kind of disaster recovery projects are extremely sensitive, extremely politically sensitive, socially sensitive. So we devised, with our planners, another way of working on it. So of course, we've done our technical scheduling. We said, let's do some socio-economic scoring. And what that meant was, let's score assets using the GIS system, and that was a boon, and run models to say, working on an asset or not working on an asset, what impact does it have on community severance? What impact does it have on the economic viability of that community? And these were, of course, these were not scientific. These were based on people who worked in that community, have operated highway assets in that community, who had that knowledge, maybe gut feel, but that's better than us being parachuted in and just making those decisions. But it also allowed us to communicate with the communities as to why we were doing the works in a particular sequence, and they could see the rationale for it, to say, okay, I understand that you're doing that bridge for that community first rather than mine, or that road asset and building that slope back again first, rather than mine for my parish, my parishioners, because it's more important, because if we don't do it first, that community is going to go downhill. And that's quite important. I think that is a role for program controllers to undertake, because if you understand why you're doing it, it's much easier to justify the schedule that you have, rather than saying, well, yeah, that can be done, but we didn't actually give it a thought. That's not a good enough answer. You have to have a story as to why you're doing stuff. That's what it looked like. So it wasn't very scientific, or that's the output out of the GG engine that we have into Excel sheets, so that we could go out into communities, filter it, let them play with it, let the local councillors and politicians actually be able to stand up in front of their community as to why they've actually bought into this idea from external parties, consultants, who are saying this is how the work's to be done. Let them own it. And that's quite important for schedulers to do, is to communicate, and communicate in a way that allows it to work. But and I'll use a lot of buts, life's not so simple. So when we scored the assets, we found we had a few high priority assets, a few medium priority assets, but most of our assets were pretty much in a bunch. That allowed us to actually have that conversation with the community to say, actually, we can now look at it from a buildability. So if you remember, funders and governance want efficiency and affordability. That's solved that problem. So if a community, or if a council or a parish is working in it, and we're working in the area, and our builders can actually give us 7 more bridges at the same time at minimal cost because the logistics are already set up, we said, we've done the need assessment. If you can deliver more in that area, this is the scope. We know we can afford it because these are minor things to be done. Do it now, because we knew, although they were low priority now, if it weren't dealt with for long periods of time, they would very soon climb up into medium priority because the assets were degrading. Cumbria has a lot of lakes and waters and streams and rivers, and they generally run around bridges and roads for some reason. And they do degrade the assets quite a lot. Because we had such a large stakeholder group to work with, we knew that if we were to produce Gantt, and we did try producing Gantt, it didn't work. Nobody understood what our plan was. We had a huge kickback to say, don't understand what you're doing. Why are you doing it? So I remember one February morning, I drew this, which was a 2-week-long program which said how we would get from the current asset condition of priorities collected together to, at the end of it, a fully functional pipeline that we could publish on the website and say, that is the work that we're going to do individually. I think the message is, you need to be communicating with intent and to be understood, irrespective of the tools that you use. This was just drawn up in PowerPoint using lines and very redundant, sketchy tools to say that's what it means, but also explain to them everything very succinctly to say, you've got type 1, type 2, type 3 projects. This is the reason why we're going to package them like this. It's open to challenge, but that's the theory. It also allowed, because ultimately that was the plan, but somebody had to do it, to people to very clearly say, oh, I understand, this is what I'm doing in this thing. And I think that is most important. And this is something that was being said this morning as well, and I've seen this on the DENS presentation as well this morning. Irrespective of what tools you prefer, step into the shoes of your audience and translate the idea as you would like it to be heard and like it to be understood. I did feel that there were a lot of planners coming in, so we did do some Gantt. And we did them for primarily working out what the logics, where the constraints were. But we allowed people to actually use whatever they used. This was the procurement schedule that was devised by a procurement lead, which was a week-by-week step through of the procurement process. And that allowed everyone to actually work to something. We did work progress tracking through actually weekly reviews, sometimes daily reviews, because at the speed at which we were going, you couldn't waste a day, you couldn't forget about a week. You had to change plans daily and pull back or actually put more resource to focus on certain areas. I'd recommend that you read, if you are into reading like me, The Theory of Constraints. Amazing book, applies to manufacturing, applies beautifully to what we do. If controllers were focusing primarily on actually unlocking constraints, life would be so much easier. And do monitor your projects on a daily basis. Look for leading indicators. One of my favorite leading indicators is going into a team and say, do you have a plan? Do you know we have a plan? Because half the times you find that most teams aren't actually aware that there's a plan that they have to be working to. Not because it's just nobody's ever told them. I'll jump through this very quickly. So cost, most important piece. We had a few issues. Disconnected processes. We had local government requirements, governance, and all the rest of it. The funders, of course, wanted a lot more confirmation of what the thing was. I couldn't actually give much of it to them because 70% of our assets had very high uncertainty because we didn't even know what was wrong with them. The industry estimating tools, they were pretty useless because nobody's actually ever documented how you repair projects, especially Roman bridges in some cases. Governance wanted affordability. PMs, of course, want some kind of flexibility to be able to work with stuff. So we used something that Mott MacDonald actually worked on many years ago, the Optimism bias theory, if you've heard of it. And we used quite a lot of our operational businesses to tell us what does it cost to repair the bridges. And we used that information to form reference class information for ourselves because this actually was relatively clear. They've done it before many times because Cumbria, because the El Nino cycle floods every 5 years. And we came up with a plan. But what we really came up with was this. When I say emergent baseline, and this is a good translation of an emergent baseline, we created a full portfolio pipeline, the affordability blue line, to say that's all of the assets, and we believe that's what it's going to cost. You only have to procure them through this governance timeline, and we will use all of that space in between to vary and understand whether we can still afford it. But even before we start delivering it, we'd have still time to actually fail, to change, to actually put across things that we were doing. And that's quite important for controls to communicate that the baseline at any point of time, irrespective of the project you're doing, is just a band in which you're working. Changes will happen, except then don't try and manage projects to a baseline. But of course, people will only believe you if you stop using Excel. I have nothing against Microsoft Office, but it's not auditable. The reason why our changes got approved very, very quickly, and if anyone from Iconex is here, or Conject is here, we used their tool. Quite early on, we invested money in it to actually say, we will actually give you an auditable track of what we're really doing. So if you've got to take something away from it, create a structure, dedicate some resourcing in actually, right at the start, what you're doing, collaborate with everyone that's on the team, and use systems, spend some money to actually get those systems on board. I'd like to tell you, we used that kind of a dashboard for performance reporting. I'd be lying. We didn't. What we used was a very different method of communicating. We used conversational communication, which allowed people to understand what we were doing. So we used a lot of EV, but more from EVM methodology of boxing stuff and working with it rather than actually doing everything. And we used a lot of technology, and I think that is the takeaway. Invest in technology, use the good methodologies, get those structures right, don't stop on it. And we created a lot of common standards for people to work to so that we could get our data in the right format, people understood it to be. And we trained not only our people, we trained the supply chain. We trained them over a period of 3 months. I've trained the supply chain 6 times on the same topic to use the systems. And that allowed us to get the stuff done. What did we achieve? Well, we achieved quite a lot, actually. We started with a 6 million anticipated baseline when we started the work. We did a projection of saying we'll deliver 25 million pounds worth of work. Those are the assets. We actually ended up delivering 26 million pounds worth of work, plus some severe assets that we discovered on the journey over the years. So not only the first 1824, we actually did a lot more. The project has won the Northwest Regional Construction Awards back, I can't remember because I was too drunk by the night. But it does actually deliver, so this actually works. Takeaways for you is get comfortable with ambiguity, get a team structure set up, and build consensus where you can. Work hard on small sprints, don't use the same methods, and be forward-looking. Don't spend a lot of time trying to clean up the muck that's been left over. Thank you. My time's up. Questions?
So faced with the same set of circumstances again, would you do anything differently?
Many things differently. It's a long story. It's a tough question. Yes. We spent a lot of time initially trying to convince the stakeholders using the traditional tools. I think we shouldn't have done that. We spent a lot of time talking in very complicated language to our suppliers, because whereas suppliers were a bit further away and we didn't realize till 3 or 4 months into the project that they had no clue what we wanted out of them. I think that is something that I would rarely do differently. Having a risk manager on board from day one would have been useful, because we were surprised 3 months later to say, oh, we haven't actually thought about that constraint. But there were lots of stuff that we could have done better. Thank you very much.